It started as nothing more than an urban legend, a whispered tale among locals about a deserted convent on the outskirts of town. I had heard the stories growing up. The nuns who once lived there, their mysterious disappearance, the eerie chanting that could still be heard at night. But I never believed in ghosts, at least not until that night. A friend of mine, Daniel, was the first to suggest we go. He had a thing for abandoned places, always dragging us to old decaying buildings to take pictures and soak in the history. This time, though, it felt different. There was a heaviness in the air just talking about it. The convent had been closed for over 50 years. Some said it was because of a fire. Others swore it was something darker, something that made even the bravest of men refuse to go near. We planned it on a whim, a Friday night just after midnight. Daniel, myself, and two others, Sarah and Miguel. Armed with only flashlights and our phones, we drove up the narrow, winding road leading to the convent. The building loomed in the darkness, its stone walls covered in ivy, its bell tower a jagged silhouette against the cloudy sky. The entrance was still intact, though the heavy wooden doors were warped with age. The moment we stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, the kind that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with arched doorways leading into empty rooms. Dust swirled in the beam of our flashlights, and our footsteps echoed unnaturally against the stone floor. We found what looked like an old chapel at the end of the hall. The wooden pews were rotting, the altar covered in a thick layer of dust. A single stained glass window, cracked but still intact, allowed the moonlight to filter through, casting strange patterns on the floor. And then, for the first time, we heard it. A soft whisper. It was faint, almost like the wind moving through the building. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. Sarah turned to me, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Before I could answer, Daniel laughed. "Relax. It's just the old building settling," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. We moved deeper into the convent, past empty dormitories and what looked like a dining hall. Then, as we entered another corridor, something changed. The atmosphere thickened. My ears started ringing, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. Then, we heard it again. Not a whisper this time. A hum. A soft melodic chant, just on the edge of hearing. And it was coming from inside the convent. Daniel was the first to break the silence. "Okay, that's actually creepy," he muttered, his flashlight beam shifting nervously across the stone walls. None of us spoke. The hum was steady, rhythmic, like an old hymn being sung just beneath the threshold of understanding. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, maybe the old walls carrying echoes from the past. But deep down, I knew better. Sarah grabbed my arm. "We should go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing hum. Daniel shook his head. "No way. If there's someone in here, I want to know who." He started walking toward the source of the sound, or at least where we thought it was coming from. Miguel and I hesitated before following. Sarah lingered behind, her fingers gripping her phone tightly. As we moved down the corridor, the sound shifted. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was above us. I lifted my flashlight, tracing the old wooden beams of the ceiling. For a second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting just out of reach, and then the hum stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. I turned to say something to Miguel, but before I could, a loud bang echoed through the hallway. It came from behind us. Sarah gasped, spinning around, her flashlight trembling in her hands. The heavy wooden door we had entered through was now shut. None of us had touched it. A cold wave of fear crashed over me. Maybe it was the wind, Miguel offered weakly, but the words felt hollow. Daniel, trying to shake off the tension, reached for the door handle. He twisted it, pulled, then yanked harder. It wouldn't budge. His face paled. Okay, not funny. The air around us grew colder. I could see my own breath forming in the dim light. The silence stretched unbearably until... Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, coming from the corridor ahead. I swung my flashlight forward, expecting to see Daniel or Miguel's shadow stretched against the walls, but what I saw made my stomach drop. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway. It was barely visible, cloaked in the darkness, but I could make out the outline of a long, flowing habit. A nun. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening. Sarah let out a shaky breath. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Then the figure moved. Not toward us, but through the doorway ahead, without making a sound, without opening it. One moment she was there. The next, she had vanished into the darkness. Miguel cursed under his breath. Tell me someone else saw that. No one needed to answer. The fear in our eyes said it all. And then the chanting started again. But this time, it was coming from all around us. The chanting grew louder, reverberating through the stone walls as if the entire convent was alive, breathing with the voices of long-dead nuns. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many. A chorus of whispers and hymns, overlapping and growing in intensity, surrounding us like an invisible force. My chest tightened as a wave of nausea washed over me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet were frozen to the cold floor. Daniel still held the door handle, his knuckles white. "This isn't real," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head, as if denying it would make it go away. Then the lights flickered. Not our flashlights. The dim glow from the broken stained glass window above. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, but Miguel cursed under his breath. "Did you see that?" he whispered, gripping my sleeve. Before I could respond, the hallway ahead of us seemed to stretch, warping in a way that defied reality. The air crackled with something unseen, a weight pressing against my skull. And then, from the darkness, footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the ancient corridors. They weren't human footsteps. They were too soft, too rhythmic, almost gliding. The sound was impossibly close, though the hallway remained empty. My breath hitched as I lifted my flashlight. She was there again. The same nun we had seen earlier, only now. She was standing just a few feet away. Her habit was old, stained, and frayed at the edges, the black fabric blending with the darkness. Her hands were clasped together in front of her, and her head was bowed slightly, as if in silent prayer. But her face, God, her face, was obscured by a deep shadow, as if the light refused to touch it. Sarah let out a strangled sob. "Please, please let us go." The nun tilted her head. The movement was slow, unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. And then, in a voice that didn't belong in this world, she spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice wasn't coming from her mouth. It was coming from everywhere, surrounding us, inside us. Daniel stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. Nope, nope, we're leaving. He turned toward the door again, yanking at the handle with all his strength. The nun stepped forward. Her feet didn't touch the ground. She glided, her presence sending a wave of ice-cold air washing over us. My entire body locked up, every muscle tensed in primal terror. The chanting grew deafening, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing. Then the lights above flickered again, brighter this time. And for the briefest second, we saw her face. There was nothing but blackness where her eyes should have been. Just two gaping voids swirling with something dark, something endless. Her mouth was twisted into a silent scream, frozen in an expression of agony. Her skin looked stretched, too pale, almost translucent. And then she lunged. The air itself seemed to explode around us. A piercing, shrill wail rang through the hallway, loud enough to make my ears ring. The temperature dropped even further, my breath coming out in ragged gasps as my vision blurred. Miguel shouted something, but I couldn't hear him over the screaming. Daniel was still struggling with the door, his hands shaking violently. Sarah was crying, backing away until she hit the cold stone wall. And then hands, cold bony fingers, wrapped around my wrist. I whipped around, my flashlight flickering. There was nothing there, but I felt it. The pressure, the unmistakable grip of something unseen. My vision darkened at the edges. My head spun. The world tilted. A loud crack echoed through the hallway. The heavy wooden door behind us flew open on its own, slamming into the wall with a force that sent dust billowing into the air. We didn't hesitate. Miguel grabbed Sarah, practically dragging her toward the exit. Daniel shoved me forward, his breath coming in panicked gasps. We sprinted out into the open night, not stopping until we reached the car. The moment we crossed the threshold of the convent, the screaming stopped. The cold lifted. The chanting vanished, replaced only by the sound of our own ragged breaths. I turned back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The convent stood in eerie silence. The broken windows stared back like hollow eyes, and in one of them, standing completely still, was the nun. Watching, we sat in the car, gasping for breath, our hands shaking too much to even start the engine. The night outside was eerily still, as if the world itself had gone silent in the wake of what had just happened. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the distant hum of the car's cooling engine. Sarah sat curled up in the back seat, her knees drawn to her chest, whispering something over and over. It took me a moment to realize she was praying. Miguel wiped the sweat off his forehead with a trembling hand. His eyes locked on the convent. Daniel gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, but he didn't start the car. None of us could move, because she was still there. The nun stood in the shattered window, motionless, her face obscured by the darkness. She wasn't trying to chase us anymore. She wasn't screaming. She was just watching. A cold realization settled over me. She didn't need to come after us. We had already brought something with us. I could feel it. The air inside the car felt heavy, pressing down on my chest like an unseen weight. It was the same feeling I had inside the convent, that suffocating dread that made it hard to breathe. I could see it in the others' faces too. We had escaped the building, but we weren't free. Daniel swallowed hard and finally twisted the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, the headlights illuminating the dirt road ahead. He wasted no time, throwing the car into gear and speeding away from the convent. No one spoke for a long time. We didn't dare. It wasn't until we reached the main road that Sarah finally lifted her head. "We need to do something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Something followed us. Miguel shot her a panicked glance. "Don't say that." "You feel it, don't you?" she said, looking at each of us. "It's here." I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. The road stretched ahead, endless in the darkness, the headlights cutting through the thick mist that had begun to roll in. I looked out the window, my stomach twisting into knots. Every shadow seemed wrong. Every tree along the road felt like it was hiding something just out of sight. And then, a figure in the road. Daniel slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, tires screeching against the pavement. We lurched forward, my seatbelt digging painfully into my shoulder. Heart hammering in my chest, I looked up. She was standing directly in front of the car. The same black habit, the same motionless stance. But this time, her face was fully visible. I wished I hadn't seen it. Her skin was stretched impossibly thin. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque, inhuman grin. The black voids where her eyes should have been seemed to move, shifting like swirling ink. Her lips parted slightly, and though no sound came out, I could feel the words she was trying to speak. "You brought me with you." The car lights flickered. Sarah screamed. The figure lunged forward. Daniel reacted without thinking, slamming his foot on the gas pedal. The tires screeched as the car jerked forward, but the moment the headlights hit the spot where she stood, she was gone. The road was empty, no trace of her, but I knew she was still there. I could feel her. Daniel didn't stop. He drove like a madman, hands gripping the wheel so tightly I thought he might break it. The town was still miles away, but we didn't care. We had to get as far from that place as possible. Miguel whispered something in Spanish under his breath, his fingers forming a shaky cross over his chest. Sarah was crying again, rocking slightly, her hands pressed over her ears. "She's still here. She's still here," she kept repeating. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The backseat mirror. The nun was sitting between Miguel and Sarah. I barely had time to scream before the car swerved violently, the tires hitting loose gravel. The world spun. A sickening lurch as we flipped once, twice, before crashing into the ditch. Darkness swallowed everything. I woke up to blinding white lights and the steady beep, beep, beep of a heart monitor. My entire body ached. My vision was blurry, my head pounding like it had been split open. I was in hospital. The memories came flooding back in fragments. The convent, the nun, the crash. I tried to sit up, wincing, as pain shot through my ribs. A voice startled me. "You're awake?" I turned my head. A nurse stood beside the bed, adjusting an IV drip. She looked at me with a gentle but cautious expression. Where are my friends?" My throat was dry, my voice hoarse. Her face darkened. "You were the only one in the car." The words didn't make sense. "No," I croaked, shaking my head. "That's not possible. They were with me. Sarah, Daniel, Miguel. She placed a hand on my arm, her grip firm but comforting. "You were found alone, miles away from town. The car was wrecked, but no one else was inside. Just you." The room felt suddenly too small. No, that wasn't right. I clenched my fists, my breathing coming faster. They were there. We all saw her. We all... And then the fluorescent lights flickered. For just a second, the beeping of the heart monitor distorted, warping into something else, something familiar. A low, rhythmic hum. I turned my head slowly toward the hospital mirror. A nun stood just behind me, watching.